So we're going to talk about the effect of a tariff on the market for sugar. And when we're talking about tariffs, we have to be specific about whether we're talking about a small country or a large country. And the definition of a small country in international economics is a country that is too small to affect the world price. So if this country decides to buy twice as much sugar, the world price effectively won't budge because they're so small. And if they decide to supply twice as much sugar, it also has no effect on the world price. So you can think of this country as a price taker. And so then essentially that has some real implications for what happens when this country, if it decides to impose a tariff. So let's have this country impose a specific tariff, and your book mentions that a specific tariff is a fixed dollar amount per unit of the goods. So we'll have a $1 per pound tariff on sugar. We can contrast that with the free trade, which you can see here, where PW stands for the world price with free trade. But we're going to put on a tariff of $1 a pound, and we can compare what happens with that. So the small country isn't able to push any of the tariff back onto its foreign suppliers, so the price in the small country rises by exactly $1 because that was the size of the tariff. And as a result of that, and given that this is a homogeneous good and the law of one price prevails, that means that the domestic industry starts to charge an extra $1 per pound for sugar. So this is the world price plus the tariff in effect. So we see that the domestic industry expands, which was probably the purpose of the tariff in the first place, because usually tariffs are imposed in response to pressure from industry groups who say that they are being unfairly targeted by cheap foreign imports, the usual story. So as you might imagine, the protection of the tariff permits the domestic industry to raise its prices and expand its own supply. And as you know, about the one thing you know about consumers is they're sensitive to the price of things. So when the free trade price of PW is raised by $1, they respond by cutting back on their consumption of this good. So if we want to look at imports and compare them under the free trade conditions and conditions with a tariff in effect, so free trade imports are equal to Q4, which is this point here, minus Q1. So there's there's more imports. So free trade imports is Q4 minus Q1. And then with this $1 tariff, the $1 tariff, imports are equal to Q3 minus Q2. So imports have shrunk as we would expect. Tariffs can be politically popular sometimes because it's fairly easy to convince people that you're imposing some kind of cost on foreigners. That's usually not the case, especially for small countries. And as we tend to do in this class, of course, the first thing we think is, well, I wonder what the welfare implications of this move would be. And so we have to examine producer and consumer surplus in order to figure out what the welfare effect is. I mean, spoiler alert, it turns out that having a tariff is worse than free trade because it moves you closer to a position of autarky. If we've proved that autarky is inferior to free trade, then some partial move back in the direction of autarky is obviously going to be worse than free trade. The relevant areas on the diagram are A, B, C, and D, and we'll sort of quickly jot down what those are. So the first thing to remind ourselves is that consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve and above the price line. So if the price line has risen, then that means the area of consumer surplus has shrunk, and the amount of that reduction in consumer surplus you can see is area A, B, C, and D. So there's been a loss of consumer surplus. So consumers are made worse off by tariffs. And then the next question is, well, I wonder where that consumer surplus went. Did it just vanish into thin air? And not entirely, actually. Some of it went to the producer. And if you recall the definition of producer surplus as the additional payments to producers over and above the minimum necessary to call forth supply, and then practically it would be the area above the supply curve and below the price line, then this area A is additional, we'll make that a negative. This is extra surplus for the producer, so that's why the producer is happy. And then we'll go on to the next area, which introduced a player that we haven't had before, but if we've imposed a tariff, then we must have a government collecting the tariff. The area C is a rectangle, and the height of the rectangle is the unit tariff, so it's $1. So the government gets $1 per unit multiplied by the level of imports, and the imports would be Q3 minus Q2. So C is government revenue. So we've sort of taken account of A and C, but B and D are perplexing. We don't have anyone to give them to, and in fact they're not given to anyone. They are referred to as the deadweight loss of the tariff, the efficiency loss associated with the tariff. So there was something about the tariff that caused the nation to experience a net loss over and above the distributive effects of the tariff. And very quickly, B is associated with supply, and that's called the production effect of the tariff. And C is associated with the demand curve, and that's called the consumption effect of the tariff. And in the next video, we'll just spend a little more time talking about what the production and consumption effects are.